Welcome to Listening and Leading, Maple Podcast. Maple Consortium Learning comes in all forms and sizes. On Leadership and Personalized Learning, we host learning tours, learning circle PLNs, master classes, summer summits, and personalized learning webinars like this one. We encourage all Maple members to attend as often as they choose. Certificates of attendance are available for receiving PDPs. Maple also provides members with a Maple discount code to several Massachusetts conferences. Easily keep in touch with Maple programming by visiting the Maple Calendar webpage at learnlaunch.org/maple-calendar. This is Daniel Downs, Director of Digital Learning in the North Reading Public Schools. Today's guest is Julie Wilson. She is the founder and executive director of the Institute for the Future of Learning, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping transform the one-size-fits-all model of education. The Institute works with a diverse range of clients, including public schools, independent schools, public charter schools, and educational philanthropic organizations. Julie graduated from Harvard's Graduate School of Education with a master's degree in technology, innovation, and education, and a Bachelor of Arts in Business Administration and French from Queen's University in Belfast, Northern Ireland. During her time as a staff member at Harvard, Julie was the recipient of the Harvard Hero Award for outstanding contributions to the university. Her book, The Human Side of Changing Education, was published by Corwin Press in May of 2018. For more information about her book, please visit www.the-ifl.org/thehumanside. And free downloadable resources are available at www.the-ifl.org/resources. Hi, Julie. Could you share with
us?
Hey, Dan. How are you?
I am well, thank you.
Very good. It's awesome to have you on this podcast from Maple, Leading and Learning. And I'm hoping that you could share a broad overview of your book for our listeners.
Sure thing. So the book in my mind is in two parts. So the first part is all about if you're leading change in a school, if you're leading change, broadly speaking, from the industrial model to the post-industrial model, what does it take to be successful in leading that change? And then the second half is more so about the individual experience of leading that change. And in all honesty, I had a dark night of the soul writing the book. I wrote 3 books. So the first book was all about, here's how to lead change, and here's why it's difficult. And it got into a really dark, negative space of, and it's really difficult, and here's why. So therefore, you probably shouldn't try. You should just try to build a new system from scratch. And I couldn't work out why I was struggling with that so much. And what I realized was, if we say that, we're basically giving up on a generation of kids. And I also know of fantastic examples of schools and districts, leaders, teachers who have led incredible change, and it just fully discounted that work. So then I sort of flipped the frame to, okay, what is the real message here? And it took me a while to get there, but what I realized after I'd written essentially the first half of the book, where I lay out what I see as the current landscape and what we can do about it, is if we've got 15,000 school districts in this country, I think it's unlikely that 15,000 school superintendents and 150,000 school principals are going to decide in the next 12 to 24 months to lead this kind of transformative change. I don't see that happening. I would love it if that were the case, but realistically, I don't see it happening. So that being the case, what are our options? And that brought me to the hero's journey and to my highly biased view, which is if every single person, either inside or outside of the school system, who has an idea to change away from this one-size-does-not-fit-all model and were to work on implementing that, then we would have a massive force for change. So the latter half talks about people just like you and me, regardless of their position, be it inside, outside of the system, what some examples of how they have walked their own hero's journey and what's possible whenever we do that. So I think of it almost as two books in one.
Wow, that's coming from. So it started off as a dark vision of the frustration of how change, isn't happening, and what it would take to kind of build it from the ground up. So that's actually very interesting, and but I think starting there is actually where you need to. I think every organization probably needs to start when they're thinking about change, is they need to think about it from the bottom up. What are these larger challenges that you see in kind of the forefront of education that you've recognized from your experience that have been inhibiting changes or creating additional challenges to the change in education?
Mm-hmm. I think probably the biggest challenge is the structure that we have. So it's based on the old industrial era model structure, which was built for control, compliance, and risk mitigation. And if we really want to build these learning environments that are highly personalized, where students are able to problem solve, think creatively, and collaborate, that's essentially 180 degrees from what the schools were originally designed to do. At its core, they were built for standardization. And if we're saying that personalization is the way forward, that structure, in my mind, is enemy number one. And that's one of the biggest challenges. The second biggest challenge that I come across are our ingrained mental models of what school is. I've been trying to think of something similar, and I can't come up with it, where the majority of the Western world has gone through this system and has a clear idea of what it looks like. And we've got multiple generations now who've gone through it. Therefore, if my mental model of, quote, good learning is 15 to 20 students sitting in a classroom with a teacher giving a motivating lecture that's highly engaging, and then I learn of this transdisciplinary, high-quality, project-based learning assignment that's embedded in the community, all of that is so different to my experience. Therefore, the level of buy-in and support that's needed from the community is significant in order to really help a school work through that change and to do so in a supportive way. So it's challenges in my mind, the biggest are the structure upon which the model is built and our individual and collective models with regards to what school is and what it looks like.
So it's almost as though these systems that we've relied upon for so long are now, working against us when we start thinking about how we're really trying to provide the best opportunities for students to learn in whatever subject area, whatever topic area. And our systems aren't necessarily designed to inspire that either. In terms of working towards a goal.
Yeah, and the system was designed in an era when content was scarce. So it wasn't so long ago that it was the teacher who had the knowledge, and the purpose of school was to disseminate that knowledge to the kids in the room. Content is now a commodity, and I oftentimes think of Tony Wagner, where he talks about it's no longer important what you know, it's what you can do with what you know. And I would take that a level further with all of the recent conversation about fake news, for example. How do you know what you know? So I've really seen in the last couple of years, 3 years, just this massive increasing of importance of critical thinking, just as an example. How can you look at multiple sources?
Yeah.
Exactly.
And the resources are readily available, and we have to kind of work now in a world where, access for most people is regularly available, and, critiquing and reviewing and revising and selecting what is using is part of the process that we need to teach, as opposed to filling the cup per se of the student and what they need. We now need to teach them how to be a little bit more of a self-directed learner in order to navigate all the available resources. So a lot of that ties to many of the promises that we've been thinking about with personalizing learning with students, is not only providing these resources in a way that can be in a very personal, self-directed, tiered, managed way that allows them to explore and find topics that they want to invest themselves into and become self-directed in a world that provides them all these resources. So I'm curious, what do you see within this framework of personalized learning that are the largest gains and also the potential pitfalls?
So I'll start with the dark side and then go to the light side. We'll do Darth Vader first and then go to Luke Skywalker.
Sure. I think more people need to do that anyways, because there's a lot of the dark side that people sometimes I think are afraid to talk about, and I think it's exciting that you want to do that, and I think that you see that as a key part of change too.
Yeah, it's like any polarity. So the dark side is personalizing essentially an obsolete model, where we lean really heavily on computer adaptive instruction. So the students are still learning algebra, but they're learning it in a highly calibrated way, which again, which is helpful and makes some sense. I'm at a different level than you are, and the software recognizes that and is able to pace each of us in an individual and personalized way. And that's all it is, and it makes an obsolete model ever more efficient. That's the dark side in my mind.
And that's a very good point, because there's so many tools that are doing that already that within another lens, you may have educators or even leaders calling that personalized learning and walking away from it and saying, we've done it.
Yes. And because the system is built for standardization and control, it will readily accept any, quote, new technology that fits that mold. Anything that challenges the outcomes, that's a much greater challenge for adoption, because there's so much more risk that goes along with it. But where I think the real promise of personalized learning is really speaking to the engagement of the student. So what does the student want to learn? Why is it important? And how can we really start to capture the intrinsic motivation? You've probably seen the data from the Gallup organization on student engagement that is really pretty high in kindergarten and has this steady decline as you go through high school in particular. And the reason for that being, I think, that the focus shifts from the learner to the content. So I think the real promise of personalized learning is to keep the learner front and center. Now, the caveat there is, I think we also have a responsibility not just to ask the student, what do you want to learn, but also to expose them to things they might not even know of, and to try and, whilst personalizing it, giving as broad an experience as possible, if that makes sense.
No, that's totally. You got me thinking there with the whole idea of breaking the mold. I think the mold becomes a very comfortable place for many, school institutions in terms of, what works and sticking with what your current understanding of what works and the framework that you had in place. And for educators, it can be difficult to change in a meaningful way, particularly if you don't have a change agent that's looking at these topics the way you just described it. If you're not looking at the value of reviewing something for, are we remaking something that we've already done before, but we're just adding technology? Or are we, are we doing something that, creates an opportunity for students, but they're still not as engaged as we were really hoping they'd be. So I think if we, what you brought up about the power of student engagement is really, really important, because that's really what drives self-directed independent learning as well, and keeping students in school, keeping students continuing to become lifelong learners, continuing to, choose to for year college choices, moving along in their life, continuing to be lifelong learners and having developed those skills from their education experience. So it's the personalized learning with these resources definitely has to be in a position to help our students succeed in what life brings, with all the added benefits of the resources and the structures that we're providing them, with the hopes that it'll provide positive opportunities for them in the future. But that also really puts a lot of weight on an organization when they look at how they're going to then begin this change in their organization. What are they going to begin to look at in order to start to make ground level changes? So that brings me to think, what does an organization need to do when they are first starting down on this path for change? I know in North Reading we've done some work with you that has really got us to start thinking about what we can adapt and what we can start to think about and challenge ourselves with, looking at a plan for more personalized learning. But in terms of your perspective as a coach and a leader within an organization, what makes an organization begin to look for change, and what do you see as some of the drivers that can really push an organization to start to make changes?
Well, I think some of the drivers that schools are experiencing across the board right now, you might have heard of that phrase VUCA. So we live in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. And the pace of change is increasing dramatically. And from my own experience, I've noticed a shift, I would say, in the last 3 to 5 years. So I want to say maybe 12-ish years ago, when Tony Wagner's book, The Global Achievement Gap, came out. We got Sir Ken Robinson, Changing Education Paradigms, Ken Kane, his work with EdLeader, Partnership for 21st Century Skills. There were these voices out there saying, look, we've got this system that was built for a different era, and the pace of change is increasing dramatically, and we need to rethink the outcomes. And there was so much conversation about the achievement gap and reform and trying to close that achievement gap. More broadly speaking, there's a more insidious threat, which is a relevance gap, that we're not preparing kids with the current model to thrive in what is essentially an unknowable future. So what I've noticed in the last 3-ish years is the conversation has shifted from talking about that to, okay, Julie, we get that. Yes, we know that. 40 million people at this point have watched Sir Ken's video. It's the most viewed TED Talk of all time, I believe. The big question is, how do we shift towards this post-industrial model, whatever that ends up being for our school or our district? So I do believe, I talk about this in the book, that there is this rising tide of consensus. If you look at Tony Wagner's survival skills, Sir Ken Robinson's, I think he's got the 8 C's. C's seem to feature for whatever reason. The Partnership for 21st Century Skills, the Deeper Learning Network. There is coherence and consensus around the skills, knowledge, and habits of mind that students will need in order to thrive in the future. And that then is putting pressure on the system to really reorganize and redesign in order to achieve those outcomes. And as I mentioned before, in many circumstances, not all, but in many circumstances, it's 180 degrees from the model that the system was originally designed.
Exactly. I think that's, one of the larger challenges, especially within public education, and particularly, K-12, we have a system that's, works in many great ways towards preparation of students for certain things, but in terms of providing expanded opportunities that will answer some of these relevancy gaps and some of the the charges of the 21st century skills and what we really need to provide students, not necessarily even within a 5-year period, but within 2, 4, 6, within a very quick window of time. Things are changing so quickly that we need to get many changes in place very quickly in an organization to, whether it's providing new types of courses, enhancements to technology. We have a number of challenges to the change. So within being within an organization and having the challenges that come along with change, that go, and then with any organization, it's all the multiple levels of an organization and bringing the understanding across all levels so that everyone can have an essential part in what needs to be shifted. There becomes a very important and valuable role to coaching and having examples of leadership that support highlighting the key components of what the change needs to look like and what are the first steps and how do we bring people together. Could you elaborate more on your experiences and your work in coaching or working with institutions around change in the district and the roles that come into play with coaching?
Sure. So I think it's helpful to start with the language. So what do we mean by coach? We've got different mental models with regards to what a coach does. In my mind, a coach builds the other person's capacities to solve their own problems. So you're not solving somebody's problem for them, but rather you're building their own capacity to do so. So it's the epitome of teaching somebody to fish as opposed to giving them a fish. And within a lot of older bureaucratic organizations, there sometimes is a culture of waiting for permission and in some cases learned helplessness. So it's really helping to build a muscle of autonomy and problem solving within the organization. And a model that I use whenever I coach both leaders and teams is a model called the GROW model. And I've been checking it out recently in Wikipedia because I'm trying to find the provenance of it. So I don't have a citation here for you, but the acronym G is for goal. So what's your end point? What does success look like? What do you want? R is for reality. So what's your current reality? What are the challenges that you're facing? What are the facts on the ground? What are you working with? O is for, in my mind, there's a different version of this, but in my mind it's options. So given what you want, given your current reality, what are your options? And then W is for way forward. So given that, what are you going to commit to action-wise? How can I support you? What's our feedback loop here? And essentially committing to action. And I love it because it's really fascinating. If you were to come to me, Dan, and say, okay, I've got this challenge that I'm working through, what typically happens is you will start with R. You will start in your reality. You'll share the challenges, the obstacles, so on and so forth. And then a good coach will ask you, okay, what do you want, Dan? What does success look like? If you had a magic wand, what would you like to see happen? So that gets you thinking forward. Okay, let me get myself out of the muck and mire of the current reality and think, okay, what do I want? And then given that, what are your options? So our knee-jerk reaction typically is for me to start telling you what to do and to give you options and to give you ideas. And then that takes away your autonomy in that space. Whereas if I just zip my lip, be lazy, don't even start thinking of ways to help you and just say, oh, okay, but what are your options? What might you do? Then you start to problem solve. Your gears start going in a very different direction. And invariably there's something there that you can try. And then I ask, okay, what's your action steps, what's your way forward, and ideally you've got one or two tangible things that you can get working on. I always remind myself, if I'm ever in a conversation and I start suggesting things, and you might have come up against this yourself, Dan, and the person starts giving you reasons as to why every single one of your ideas won't work, or they've tried it in the past, that's a good indication. Oh, Julie, you're into telling mode here and trying to solve somebody else's problem. Okay. All right, let me just step back. Do you want help? Because sometimes people don't, right. And that's totally valid. You might just want to vent. I know I've had many times when I just need to vent and blow off some steam. But if I do want help, then I'm hoping the other person will help push me with some coaching, broad, open-ended questions.
It's amazing. That is, and I guess the hard part for people who aren't as trained in coaching or working with others is to know to call upon that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I remember hearing a speaker one time, and this sort of blew my mind. I still, knew a lot, where she said you basically control three things: what you think and what you say and what you do. And that really gave me pause. So in any given circumstance, because I work in large bureaucratic organizations where oftentimes there is this sense of learned helplessness and it's me against the system, and I've been trying this for 6 months and I'm exhausted, and there are so many stakeholders, and there are so many, I'm looking here at 350 emails that I haven't even looked at, never mind responded to. Where is my capacity to act here? You always have capacity to make a choice in the moment.
Right. Wow, that's powerful. That's very powerful. And just recognizing that those three items is all that you really have the capacity to do in that moment. So what you decide to put out at that time has the most impact in those those capacities. Now, how does the shifting? What are some breakthroughs that you think are, that you see the aha moments per se in the shifts? I've seen you work personally in my own district with teacher groups and administrators, and and I think you definitely that options, and getting us to discuss the value of options, and brought us to a couple unique breakthroughs on our own. How do you know a group is close to a breakthrough, or what do you think positions them well to a breakthrough? And what are, say, someone is doing this without a coach, and maybe they're a team of administrators or leaders, and they've been working on some initiatives, and they've been really committed to trying to get a better cohesive understanding of some very valuable pieces going on in their district. What can they do? What are some tactics for leaders that find themselves in that position where they're working on something that's not necessarily maybe getting the traction they need? There's definitely some buy-in, but it's hard to bring a vision maybe to the full picture. There are some challenges. What are some suggestions you can make in that scenario for leadership during meetings or in another environment? And then what are some signs maybe of what it might be coming to fruition that you might not notice if you haven't been doing this kind of work?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So there are a couple of tools that I'll share that I think will be helpful. So one is called the 4 Ps. And this is from a book called Managing Transitions by William and Susan Bridges. And I talk about this model in the book as it pertains to K-12. So Bridges talks about the distinction between change and transition. Change is external and an event, whereas transition is internal and psychological. So an example would be moving house. Let's just make it really basic. On a given day, the moving truck comes, the boxes are put into the truck, they're offloaded in your new house, whatever distance away. That's a change. You've moved house. Now, the transition to that house becoming your home is going to take much longer than the hours that it took for the external change. And is an internal psychological process. And I remember myself a couple of years ago moving from Marblehead to Cambridge, and that took place, in 6 hours, moving truck boxes, etc. But vivid memory. 6 months late. 6 months later, driving home from a workshop, and I was halfway to Marblehead before I remembered that I didn't live there anymore.
Wow.
So even when a change is of our own volition and choice, the transition takes much longer. And I think if leaders can understand that and therefore take the long-term view with this work, that it's not the case that we're going to, and I think schools do a good job of bringing communities together, talking about the change that they would like to see, and really getting collective input and a vision. That's the change, but the transition to actually having that be experienced by the students on the ground, that can take anywhere from 3 to 7 years, depending on the starting point of the school or district. So understanding that this is long-term work, and in my mind it's generational work, because it has to be sustainable and meaningful. There's way too much boiling of the ocean that goes on, and that's because we overchange and we under-transition. And Bridges talks about the ending, the neutral zone, and the new beginning. And the ending, I think in the Western world, we don't do a good enough job of endings. So what is it that we're actually going to sunset here? Given this vision, what are we currently doing that no longer works? And another key point from this framework is that it involves loss. So people typically don't resist change, they resist loss. As the saying goes, nobody ever gave away a winning lottery ticket. That's a whole lot of change, not a whole lot of loss.
And if people don't necessarily aren't in a stage of the transition and they learn about loss, that can bring fear.
Yes.
What's next?
And again, in my experience with schools, the biggest loss that I see, and when leaders understand this, it gives them a whole other level of empathy and a whole other understanding of what they can do to support people. The biggest loss that I see, particularly with educators, is loss of competence. So if I've been teaching a certain way for 3 years, 5 years, 25 years, and you're telling me that I now need to structure this in a different way, that I need to partner with 2 other teachers, and we need to build high-quality project-based learning, and we're using this rubric, or it has to be personalized to every kid, you're taking me way out of my comfort zone, again, depending on where the school is starting from. And if we can understand and have empathy for and provide structure and help to address that feeling of loss of confidence and competence and being outside of the comfort zone, then we will have a force for change. Because the neutral zone, it's equal parts confusion and uncertainty and learning and creativity. So we really want to establish a container there that will help folks get through the neutral zone in a way where they're building the skills to be able to thrive in the new reality. And we can't shove people through it any more than you can shove a child through adolescence.
Right. You have to be patient.
It's an organic process of growth.
Oh, that's great. That's good stuff. That's powerful. Because I think, there are so many changes, I think, and technology definitely has brought upon very quick change. So I think we have some educational environments that people necessarily haven't completely transitioned to a full kind of taking account of what technology has brought into the classroom, what students are bringing into the classroom with their needs with technology. There's just so much external that also impacts these changes that, that example of pushing a child through adolescence is just, we have to really account for all the environmental factors in these environments to support where we want to go to next with with our goals and what we want to bring into the classrooms. And also,
Yeah.
I think that idea of the container is a beautiful way of expressing that as well, in that you're really kind of making a terrarium for the healthiest environment that can be possible, and nurturing the teacher who's on the ground floor, and giving them the support and what they feel like they need, and at the same time enhancing people's understanding of what the transition could look like.
Mm-hmm. You're reminding me, Dan, just thinking of another Maple district, Revere, and Lorenzo Garcia and the work that he has been leading up in Revere. I believe that every single educator is part of a personalized learning group at Revere. I think that's a wonderful container for this kind of work. And I shared Lorenzo's example in the book where he talked about how they really went with the train the trainer, train the facilitator model, because they wanted to make sure that they were building capacity within the school.
And the capacity is a huge component. It's just everyone feeling, right? It's really a feeling. It's everyone really feeling like they can do it. Whatever, that back to that competency. What's being talked about is something either I have done in my classroom, I want to do more of, I understand the value of, because I understand the real benefits. And yeah, I'll let you speak.
Yeah, you reminded me, Dan, just when you mentioned that about another helpful tool. Again, this is from our friends William and Susan Bridges, where they talk about the 4 Ps. So when you're in the middle of change, it can feel entirely messy, and are we making any progress, and what the heck are we doing here anyway? The 4 Ps is very grounding. So the first P is for problem. What is the problem we're trying to solve here? So in my mind's eye, personalized learning solves the problem of a standardized system of education that rewards language, logic, and recall, and ignores anything that falls outside of those boundaries oftentimes. So what's a problem that we're trying to solve here? It could be something like we're not preparing our kids adequately for the future. Whatever the problem is that we're trying to solve. The second P is picture. So what does the picture of success look like? And this is incredibly motivational. So if you were a movie director and you were to fast forward in the future, what will success look like? How will you know it if you see it in action? So the second P is for picture. The third P is for plan. So how are we going to get from here to there? And oftentimes the project plan is pretty specific, up to 6, maybe even 12 months out, but beyond that it becomes less granular. So what's the, 1 to 5 year time horizon? What are the immediate short-term things we're working on? What are those longer-term milestones that we want to reach? And then the fourth P is part. So to your point about the professional learning groups in Revere, ideally everybody is playing a part in making this change happen. And part of the challenge and opportunity there is oftentimes there is no nice, neat spreadsheet on the Google Drive or Dropbox folder that articulates how all of this is going to happen.
Right. There's no roles diagnosed, and this person takes care of this, this person takes care of this, and in the end we'll be done.
Yes. So it's ongoing, iterative changing as opposed to here's a nice spreadsheet, and if we just follow this, we're ultimately going to get to our destination. It's really, again, back to building capacity and providing the resources and supports for that.
And that really allows everyone to, really grow and lead when they can or want to. That you kind of can get that ebb and flow of a skill set out of if a teacher wants to try something new in year 2, as opposed to, trying to do something maybe they aren't ready for in year 1 in the classroom, or and maybe it's an introduction of a new piece of technology. Maybe it's better in year 3 when we've worked the capacity of our use of technology in the first couple of years and thought about how it's really going to be implemented. To maybe it's more for a student benefit, maybe it's more for a program benefit. These are all really important considerations, and I think it really highlights your ability to, your coaching work that you've done and the work you've done with institutions to kind of bring about these action plans that, bring upon these long-term changes. So, kind of what other guidance can you provide a district that is thinking about making shifts? What are some starting points maybe you can lead us in? And, how can you, and I'll tie it back to your book, what could a educational leader, K-12 or even higher ed, take from your book to kind of help them get started? And, if they picked up your book and they're really inspired, what are some ways to kind of frame that inspiration towards taking change on?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So in the book, I talk about 5 success factors for change. So the caveat here is every school and district is different. So there is no one-size-fits-all here. At the same time, I've noticed that those change initiatives that are successful, these success factors are usually in place. So I'll share each of the 5 briefly, and then I'll talk about 3 different types of change, which is another model which I think can help leaders frame this. So the 5 success factors, number 1 is sustained leadership and a visionary and supportive school board. So I would love that it weren't the case, but in my experience, this kind of change takes anywhere from 3 to 7 years. Not only to implement, but to really embed it in how the school functions, and for it to be both meaningful and sustainable. And that requires sustained leadership. It also requires a board that gets the vision, and also a board that will support its leaders whenever things don't work out, which is pretty much guaranteed to happen. So any path of change, there will be moments when it feels like everything is just thrown up in the air and it's not going according to plan. And where I've seen some plans fall apart is when the board no longer supports what's happening. And if the board doesn't support, then the change is pretty much dead in the water at that point. The second one is a shared vision of change, and this speaks to the broader community, both inside and outside the school. And I think schools do a great job of bringing communities together and talking about what, the vision and where we want to head. Where I think there is some opportunity there is helping communities understand the problem that we're trying to solve and the reality of what these kids will be walking into. I think if we start to have more open conversations about the problem we're trying to solve, I think that will be a real force for change. The third success factor is unleashing talent and building teams. So this is really unleashing the talent in schools and districts and helping people think outside of their explicit role and how they might be involved in this change, again, outside of the confines of their role, and what sort of structures make sense in order to facilitate that, and how we can come together as interdisciplinary teams to make it happen and to build capacity. The fourth one is rethinking the use of time and space. So, so much of school is based on the Carnegie unit, and we need to stop assessing time and start assessing the actual learning. And rethinking the use of space, rethinking that we just have this school building at Ardagh School and that's it. And there's some great examples of innovation that's happening there. And then the fifth success factor, and oh, by the way, is completely overhauling the assessment structure of learning and school performance. That, in my mind, is one of the biggest factors for overall systems-level change within the entire world of education, because we're still assessing, for the most part, and valuing the assessment of recall, logic, language, and recall. And until we change that, the assessment tail is going to wag the dog. Right now, we're valuing what we assess, and we, for the most part, don't assess what we value. Now, there's great work happening with organizations like the Mastery Transcript Consortium and EDUCAUSE and their assessment for learning project. So there's great work happening there. At the same time, I think it's helpful for communities to understand that we're actively building the field here of assessing what we truly value. So those are the 5 success factors. The second, I'll mention this just briefly. This is from Tony Bruno and Ken Kerber, called The 3 Different Types of Change. And they talk about directed change, planned change, and iterative changing. So directed change is we're changing the physics textbook from version 13 to version 14. That's directed change. We know that process. It's a pretty standard change to make, and it's happening. Planned change is the kind of change where we're bringing the community together, we're doing our strategic planning, we're talking about what matters, where we want to go, and so forth. And again, I think schools are pretty well versed in that type of change. Where I think we've got great opportunity is iterative changing. And that's where we're bringing groups of folks together, actively working in a space of discovery and trial and error, and working this out as we go along. And a great example of where that's happening is assessment. So there is no, for example, valid and reliable measure that I know of out there to assess creative problem-solving skills in this particular area. So that being the case, we are actively working this out as we go along. And that requires cycles of iteration. And I think if schools were to really build that capacity for iterative changing, essentially building change resilience, then we've got a massive
Right.
engine for ongoing meaningful change, not just change for change's sake, but meaningful change.
Right, and reflective, iterative change brought upon by, and I think your point there around the value, what do we assess, don't assess what you're not assessing what we value, and just being able to bring that mindset to a broader scope, broader set of people who can impact the change. I mean, what you just outlined was great, because it's, I think sometimes, when I mentioned this kind of a bit when you talk about courses and programs and studies and things, is sometimes you need to unsilo the thinking around particular items to really understand where they fit, and look at why students need certain skills beyond just what they're getting in the day-to-day. What experiences become value, and that's a difficult argument to make sometimes when it's too siloed down into what's happening, and people don't necessarily have the perspective of our world is changing. We need to do these action items. We need to be better at preparing students. But if we don't have an iterative approach to reviewing what we value and what we want the future of learning to look like, and we aren't prepared to adjust it as quickly as we create it and review it and assess it, we're always going to be a little bit behind, what we could be doing, in schools. Now, so what you just outlined is great. I appreciate all the time you spent with me today. And then I would say, in my experience, working with you in our district has been fantastic. You not only helped frame the value of personalized learning within our district and help our educators have a understanding where it fits in teaching and learning, but we also have had the benefit of working with you and getting working with our teams to help uncover topics that we really need to be discussing, helping us develop a little bit of a vision for our work moving forward, and doing it in a way that I think we all feel like we have a collective part in the process, which is very powerful. So, Julie, I appreciate the work you've done with us to do that, and being able to do this podcast is great to help me not only thank you, but also I want others to be able to understand the value you bring to this topic and the immense knowledge you bring to the topic of organizational change. And I highly recommend you getting her book and getting to know her processes better and reveal more of your insight of going from that dark side that you kind of explained.
The Darth Vader side, personally.
But I think when you say that, you set the stage. You're setting the stage for people understanding that, you're going to have to look at some things you might not want to look at in the beginning to frame change. And in this, I think you set that groundwork. It helps prepare people to do that work as well. So it's amazing, and I appreciate all you've done for us, and getting to know you through Maple has been a powerful experience for our district and the work you've been doing. So I thank you.
Well, thank you, Dan. Thank you for having me on the podcast, and it's great working with you and the team there at North Reading. You're all leading great and much needed work.
No, and thank you, and I look forward to keeping my eye out for your name at events on Twitter, and I'll share all that information within the links of this podcast. And thank you for joining us for the Maple Learning and Leading podcast.